Live from California, this is BBC News. The second Republican U.S. presidential debate is underway here in Simi Valley. And former President Donald Trump skips the debate again to visit blue-collar workers in Detroit, where a strike against 3 car makers continues. Plus, the U.S. government moves closer to a partial government shutdown, with House lawmakers in a stalemate. Hello, I'm Katrina Perry, live at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, where the second Republican presidential debate is underway. We're in the middle of the debate that is taking place in the building behind me here, and already border security, immigration and crime have dominated the talking points, along with 2 people who are not there, US President Joe Biden and the leading 2024 Republican candidate, former President Donald Trump. The debate, televised by the Fox Business Network and Univision, features 7 candidates. They were required to reach polling and donor thresholds set by the Republican National Committee in order to take part. But for the second time in his 2024 campaign, Donald Trump isn't here. The 77-year-old has suggested that sharing a stage with what he deems low polling rivals could only hurt his commanding lead. It comes as he faces mounting legal challenges and indictments, and just 4 months before the Iowa caucuses begin that formally launch the GOP's nomination process. Donald Trump instead is in Detroit, where he's been speaking to car workers and blue-collar employees. That comes after Joe Biden became the first sitting US president to join a picket line on Tuesday at the invitation of the United Auto Workers, the union striking at 3 major car makers. Well, a little earlier, I spoke with CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Ed O'Keefe, thanks for joining us. Well, second debate, what can we expect from tonight?
I think you're going to see these 7 that are on stage tonight. Some call them the JV team, some call them the vice presidential tryouts. What they're really trying to do is get it from 7 to maybe 2 or 3 by January, when Iowa and New Hampshire start really voting and thinking about this more seriously. It is still very early. So keep plodding along, trying to make their points, hoping that others run out of money, run out of polling steam, and can no longer make the stage, and continue drawing, if not sharp, at least gentle contrasts with former President Trump for a sizable number of Republican primary voters across the country, and especially in Iowa and New Hampshire, who continue to say, I'm thinking about the former president, but I'm open to somebody else. And about a quarter of the Republican electorate continues to say, I don't want him. I'm looking for somebody other than him to eventually become the nominee. So there's plenty of time. They'll be having one of these each month going into January and beyond, and it will help eventually winnow the field.
With the exception of Nikki Haley, who has moved up a little bit, there's very little movement in all of the polls. So are we kind of suggesting here that ignore all the polls there and wait for the voters to get into those caucuses?
If you're somebody outside the United States looking at this and wondering what's the best way to gauge how this is going, don't look at those national, essentially beauty contest or name identification figures. Look at how they're doing in the states of Iowa and New Hampshire, which will go first and second. Those are the 2 most reliable states to poll right now. And what you're seeing is a tighter race. You saw a slight uptick for Nikki Haley, but you still see Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in second. So inevitably, among the other 5 on stage, the 2 of them are likely going to get the most heat from everybody else. Or if you're one of those lower tier ones, you want to knock out somebody else in order to get to Haley and DeSantis. And there's still plenty of time to do that.
So what can they do to do that? How can they set themselves apart from each other?
Talk about what it means to be a conservative. Talk about abortion access in this country. Are you for more or less of it, stricter abortion laws or more lenient ones? Do you talk about the fact that while it may be a bedrock principle of the Republican Party to restrict abortion services, it's politically tricky for them right now to be doing that when polling shows that there is broader support for broader access? On foreign policy, do you see them discuss future funding for the war in Ukraine, more or less or about the same? And what does it mean to be a Republican? That is still a big part of what's going on here in the GOP. Yes, former President Trump dominates, but he won't always be there. So what will the future of the party look like? More populist or more traditional conservative like Ronald Reagan once was?
In many ways, though, it feels like the main campaign has kicked off. We saw Joe Biden on the picket line. We see Donald Trump tonight in a non-union house, but still talking to auto workers. Like, those two have decided to leave everybody else behind.
Sure, because month after month, he's leading by double digits. And it very well ultimately may be that he pulls it off. Certainly Democrats and the White House hope it's him. They know how to beat him. They did it before, and they believe they can do it again. They get more worried and concerned and confused if somebody else starts to emerge, in part because it becomes a generational contrast. And that is when they know right now they probably would lose. So you're seeing the president's campaign running ads in Michigan tonight, calling out Trump. You're going to see him go to Arizona tomorrow to call out his concerns about the future of democracy, reminding people what happened on January 6th, who they were doing that for, and what Trump and his supporters have done and said in the years since. That is an issue that still polls very well and is of concern to a majority of Americans. It's one Republicans don't necessarily want to talk about, but it's one the White House and Democrats certainly do.
So Joe Biden is very much in campaign mode then?
Little by little, he's getting there. He's spending time here in California and in other parts of the country raising the millions of dollars he's going to need for next year. But every so often he holds an event like the one he will tomorrow. It starts to remind people, this is what I'd look like as a candidate next year.
Speaking of money, there's a fundraising deadline looming large next week. How are all the Republican candidates doing in terms of those financials that mean they can stay in or they have to get out?
It's a good question, and it's less to me about how much they've raised, but how much they still have in the bank. Can you afford to keep traveling to Iowa and New Hampshire and thinking ahead to South Carolina, and maybe even to here in California and the other states that'll vote on one big day in March of next year? Or are you seeing them have to pare back, lay off staff, and travel less and get more face time perhaps on television in order to get the word out? Those that have enough in the bank to continue going through the fall are the ones that will survive. Those that don't, it's going to become increasingly hard to convince anyone to give you $5, let alone $5,000. And so you'll start to see the field shrink as the year progresses.
Well, we'll see what happens tonight. First of all, Ed O'Keefe of CBS News, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Well, a little earlier, I also spoke with Mark Short. He was the former chief of staff to Mike Pence when he was vice president. Mr. Pence has only been polling in the single digits, and as he looks to break from the pack, we spoke about the impact that Mike Pence needs to make before the end of tonight's debate. What does he need to do at tonight's debate?
Well, I think he needs to stay the course. He needs to remind American voters that he, and more than anyone on that stage, inherits the legacy of Ronald Reagan as the most traditional conservative, classical conservative, across-the-board spectrum conservative, whether or not it's how would you address the problems of national security with Iran, Russia, China today, how would you address the failing economy in the United States, how would you address so many of the family issues that are confronting our nation. So I think that that's the course for him to continue to remind American voters that that's who he is, and those are the solutions to the problems we face today.
But more than anyone else on that stage, he also inherits the legacy of Donald Trump.
Sure, and I think he's proud of that legacy. I think that he feels like those 4 years that a lot was accomplished, that was good for our country, whether or not it was rebuilding the military or reducing the corporate tax rate in America to make us more competitive on the global stage. But I also, obviously the events around January 6th were very public, and I think that separation was over Mike's commitment to the Constitution. And unfortunately, Donald Trump violated his and asked his vice president to disregard his oath to the Constitution. And that's an important part of Mike's story as well.
Is it hard for him to ask voters to separate that out, though, to separate him out from Donald Trump?
I think it is, but at the same time, I think that most elections in America are about the future, not about the past. And so I think it's important that he continue to articulate what his vision is for the nation going forward and how his policies will solve the problems we face.
Ronald Reagan, as we are here in his presidential library, stood over a very different Republican Party than the one we have today, particularly around America's place in the world, foreign policy. Mike Pence is one of the few candidates who wants to bring America back into that role, as Reagan would have called it, the world's policeman, really. Will he be seeking to emphasize that tonight?
I think that it's a fair point. I don't know if I would describe it as the world's policeman. I don't think that he views that is necessary a role, but he believes that the world is safer when America is strong. And when America retreats from from that role, just as the same with UK. I think that we believe that the world is less safe, and so it's important that America continue to stand for freedom and continue to stand for the principles that I think have drawn people to our country. And if we abandon that and shirk from our responsibilities, I think that the world is less safe for everybody.
But we're seeing the Republican Party step back from funding Ukraine, for example. I mean, there are divisions arising within the party over that.
There are important policy debates in that, and I think some of that's understandable because ever since 9/11, I think that we've been asking our men and women to serve overseas, and I think America is tired of that, and that's understandable. But at the same time, there has to be a leader who stands up and explains that Vladimir Putin his ambitions are beyond Ukraine, and if we think that he's going to stop there, I think we're grossly mistaken. And then American men and women would be sent to fight to protect freedom, as opposed to right now. I think the greatest return on investment is that Russia, perhaps the second largest military in the world, is probably now the second largest in Ukraine, and that's a great return on your investment.
With Donald Trump so ahead of the rest of the field, is there a point at which Mike Pence would step out of the race, or is he there till the right end of the primary season?
I think there's more uncertainty than ever before because there's so many legal hurdles that Donald Trump still faces. I think there's no doubt that with each indictment, it's rallied Republicans because they feel like many of these are politically charged. But there's so many hurdles ahead that I think that even though polls show what they do, there's a lot of uncertainty about this race still.
Watch this space, as they say. Yeah. All right, we'll leave it there for the moment. Mark Short, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Now to Donald Trump's counter-programming, where he addressed workers at a plant in Michigan after touring a manufacturing facility there. He's been speaking about protecting US workers from foreign competition.
I want a future that protects American labor, not foreign labor. A future that puts American dreams over foreign profits, and a future that raises American wages, that strengthens American industry, that builds national pride, and that defends this country's dignity, not squanders it all to build up foreign countries that hate us.
Well, we can go live now to Luigi Jokai, who's Vice President of the United Auto Workers Union Local 51 branch. Luigi Jokai, thanks indeed for joining us. You heard a little bit there of what Donald Trump has been saying, obviously there this evening in Detroit, Michigan. What's your reaction to what he's been saying?
My reaction is we've had 4 years of Donald Trump. We've had almost 4 years of Joe Biden. And the auto workers are going to have to look at that and see who really has our back. A lot of people are going to try to come in the 11th hour and throw their weight and support behind us now that we've gone on this massive strike, this historical undertaking. And we're going to judge them by what they do, not what they say.
Going on strike is not easy for workers, but when you see the former president there tonight, although he was at a non-union house, I believe, but the former president there tonight, the current president there last night, the first question at the debate here tonight has been about the striking workers. All of that attention must be welcome, though, is it?
Yeah, we're glad that it's shining a light on the auto worker struggle and what we're trying to accomplish here with this strike. But again, I'm looking for more than just words.
Now, Donald Trump did mention there the threat of jobs moving to China, the threat to the traditional auto industry from electric vehicles, some things that you and your members feel very strongly about as well.
Yeah, we're always looking at what the next trade deal is. We don't ever want to go backwards. Some things have gotten fixed with the old NAFTA. We never want to go back to that era of the giant sucking sound of the automotive industry getting offshored. Electrification, we want to make sure that it's going to keep employing union workers and it's going to make sense. We're not going to lose any jobs over it. And also that the materials are going to be ethically sourced. The UAW's fight is not just for the union workers, it's for middle class and working families everywhere. We created the middle class. We want to keep that battle. We want to keep that at the forefront of these political debates. We don't want it to just be about the politics and the politics. We want it to really focus on what we're trying to accomplish here.
You're 2 weeks or so into the strike now. In terms of what you are trying to accomplish, how are the negotiations going?
From what our leaders have told us, Ford is looking a little more progress than the other two. As was evident that the other parts plants at Ford were not called to stand up and go on strike. GM's and Stellantis were. And we're waiting. There should be an update later in the week from our president, Sean Fain, to see where they're at. We're optimistically waiting to see where we're at, and we're ready. If they got a good deal, we're ready to vote in a good deal. The members do have that right to vote it in or vote it down. And if the deal is not what we've been talking about over the last few years, then we're ready to stand up and go on strike as well.
Do you think that the strike might be expanded then on Friday? That might be in that announcement?
It's always a possibility. We really don't know. The negotiations are being kept tight as they should, and we're getting updates as we should. Everything's been going real good as far as communication, but obviously they're not going to give daily updates or hourly updates. And when it's time for us to hear something, our leaders will absolutely notify us, as they have been over the last 12 days.
Now, for those workers who are not striking but who are continuing to work under expired contracts, how is that? How is that working out?
It presented some unique issues. It's something I've never, seen in my 13 years. I don't believe even some of the more legacy workers with 20 to 30 years have had that happen. So it presents some unique challenges, but we were prepared for it. We have resources at our disposal, and we're working through those issues on a day-to-day basis, on a plant-by-plant basis. But I'll tell you what, I'm glad I have a union that is there to fight for me every single day.
Okay. Luigi Jokai of the United Auto Workers Union, thanks for bringing us up to date on BBC News. And just a quick programming note, we will have an hour-long look at the second Republican debate here in Simi, California at 11 p.m. on East Coast time. That's 4 a.m. in London, or about 45 minutes from now. We'll break down the winners and losers of the night with a panel of experts and highlight the most memorable moments, so do tune in for that a little later on. Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Let's have a look at some of the other stories making the news. In the Iraqi city of Hamdaniya, mourners gathered to bury the people killed in a fire at a wedding. The blaze killed more than 100 people in the country's biggest Christian town. The fire started when flares ignited a ceiling decoration. The Red Crescent says hundreds were injured. GB News has suspended two of its presenters, Dan Wootton and Lawrence Fox, after sexist comments Fox made on Wootton's programme Tuesday night about a female political journalist, which the channel said were completely unacceptable. Wootton apologised for what he called a very unfortunate lapse in judgment. The reporter Ava Evans said she feared for her safety. The channel has opened an investigation. Storm Elias flooded parts of central Greece on Wednesday. Heavy rain in the city of Volos flooded several roads near the port there. Video shows vehicles trying to manoeuvre through the floods as emergency crews patrol the area, rescuing people trapped. Landslides and power outages have been reported. You're live with BBC News. In Washington, there's been no clear progress in efforts in the House to avoid a partial government shutdown by Sunday. Republican hardliners have been threatening to block the passage of spending legislation unless there are significant budget cuts. President Biden said key government services could be disrupted.
A lot of vital work in science and health could be impacted, from cancer research to food safety. So the American people need our Republican friends in the House of Representatives to do their job.
House Speaker Kevin McCarthy says he plans to introduce a stopgap spending bill on Friday, but it's still not clear whether that could pass. The US soldier Travis King, who is being held in North Korea, is on his way home right now. Private King entered North Korea by running across the demilitarized zone in July. He had been due to be flown to the US to face military disciplinary proceedings when he escaped his escort. On Wednesday, North Korea said it would expel the soldier for illegally entering its territory. He was taken to China, placed in US custody, and is now on his way to an American military base. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan thanked Sweden and China for their assistance in gaining Private King's release. Now to a crisis unfolding in a region disputed by both Armenia and Azerbaijan. The exodus of ethnic Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh surpassed 50,000 people on Wednesday. More than a third of residents have fled in the aftermath of Azerbaijan's military takeover last week. Many have ended up in the town of Goris, from where our correspondent Sarah Rainsford reports.
Well, the flow of refugees from Nagorno-Karabakh is not only continuing, it's increasing and intensifying. You can see behind me here just one car, but there's streets full of cars like this piled up with people's possessions, roof racks piled high, boots jammed full, and the cars themselves full of families. We've seen 7 or 8 people squeezed into some cars. We even saw a dumper truck yesterday with children on board, a couple of dozen children peering over the top of that truck, because people are using any transport and any means they can to leave Nagorno-Karabakh and come here to Armenia, because what they're telling me when they get here is that they don't feel safe to stay in that enclave now. They have been told by the Azerbaijani authorities that they would be protected, that their human rights are guaranteed, but nobody I've spoken to believes that information. They can't trust it. There have been so many wars between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and in Nagorno-Karabakh specifically, that the people who have lived there for decades now say they have to leave. And there have been a lot of tears. It's a really depressed mood as people flood over into Armenia. These are people who don't believe they're ever going back to Nagorno-Karabakh. And a lot of them have said it's kind of like it's an exodus, you know, it's not a temporary evacuation. They don't believe they'll see their homes again. And that means a huge amount. People have left their graves behind of their loved ones. They've left, some of them, the graves of people who died fighting for Nagorno-Karabakh. This is a piece of land that means a huge amount to Armenians. Of course, it means a lot to Azerbaijanis too. Around about 1 million Azerbaijanis were actually forcibly displaced from that same territory back in the early 1990s. It is a hotly disputed piece of land, but it is now the Armenians who are being forced to leave. And this area where we are now is struggling to cope with the exodus. There are refugees staying in all of the hotels here, in some of the other facilities too, and even people sleeping in their cars overnight. And there's now another town that's opened up for refugees a couple of hours from here because the intensity of that flow now is so huge.
Ukraine has wrapped up oral arguments in its ongoing case against Russia before the International Court of Justice. Kyiv has tried to demonstrate that Russia's military intervention is based on unfounded allegations of genocide and therefore within the jurisdiction of the court. Our correspondent Anna Holligan was there.
This represents the end of a small but critical part of the process. The legal arguments have been extensive and complex, but let me bring you right up to date on the final day of these jurisdiction hearings. So Ukraine told the judges that breathtaking atrocities continue to this day, and going back to February 2022 accused Russia of systematically abusing the Genocide Convention, recognising sham republics, brutalising civilians, all for the apparent purpose, Ukraine said, of preventing a non-existent genocide while in truth executing a self-serving invasion. Kyiv's representatives referenced the landmark day in court last week when a record 32 countries stood with one strong and united, dignified voice, Ukraine said, in support of their claim. Russia had dismissed this united action, saying it was part of a dark conspiracy. But what Kyiv's representatives pointed out was that not one other country was prepared to stand inside the Peace Palace and speak in support of Russia. They said that was because so many countries wanted to preserve and protect the integrity of this vital convention, the Genocide Convention. Ukraine's co-agent ended the session by juxtaposing the days in court with events happening almost simultaneously on the ground in Ukraine. Drone strikes, missile attacks, civilian casualties. And she reminded the judges, we came to you a year and a half ago we still need your protection today. The judges have now retired. They will consider the points presented by both sides before deciding whether or not this case continues, whether or not they have a legal mandate to hear this case. That decision is expected within the next 6 months. Ukraine's representative cautioned, "We do not have the luxury of time."
To India now, where demonstrators have clashed with police for a second day in the capital of the northeastern state of Manipur. India has reimposed an internet ban and schools have been closed. Protests began when photos emerged of the bodies of 2 students from the MIT community who went missing in July. Israel's Supreme Court will hear on Thursday petitions against a new law passed by Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition, which makes it more difficult to declare a Prime Minister unfit for office. The law states that only the Prime Minister himself or the Cabinet can declare the leader unfit, and only due to physical or mental incapacity. The Cabinet vote would then need to be ratified by a 2/3 majority. Petitioners have called for the striking of the law, arguing the legislation was passed solely for Netanyahu's benefit as he faces an ongoing corruption trial. And finally, US astronaut Frank Rubio said it's good to be home. He spent more than a year on board the International Space Station. His 371 days in space set a record for US space travel. Rubio and 2 Russian cosmonauts touched down in southeast Kazakhstan on Wednesday. The crew was set to return 6 months ago, but a leak in their original spacecraft delayed their return. Well, I'm Katrina Perry at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library here in Simi Valley in California. Thanks for watching and do stay with us here on BBC News. Take care now.